This is Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell, all talk and all crime. New revelations looking into the triumphant, tormented, and ultimately tragic life of former President Richard Nixon. And are there comparisons to President Trump as well? Today on Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. John Farrell is the author of Clarence Darrow, Attorney for the Damned, and Tip O'Neill in the Democratic Century. A longtime investigative journalist, he worked at the Denver Post and at the Boston Globe, where he served as White House correspondent and on the Spotlight team that uncovered sexual abuse by the clergy in the Catholic Church. His brand new book out, generating buzz, Richard Nixon, The Life. Welcome, Jack. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Thank you very much for having me on.
Oh, it's our honor. By the way, Tip O'Neill and Richard Nixon, could you have found two more different political figures?
Yeah, one was warm and cuddly. The other one was a little bit standoffish, huh?
First off, why do you think there is this ongoing fascination with Nixon?
The original title for the book, the working title, was Richard Nixon, An American Tragedy. And I think there's just people just seeing him, a guy who came up from nowhere, had everything, and then lost it because of a tragic flaw. And I think that people are going to be fascinated with this guy for centuries, and that probably somewhere in the afterlife he's looking up at us now, and he's saying, good, I'm glad I made my mark the way that I did.
Perhaps one of the bigger revelations in the book is this sort of alleged violation of the Logan Act, and we're talking obviously about the Chenault affair that you've essentially revealed by backing it up, essentially. Tell us the story.
Sure. In 1968, Lyndon Johnson desperately wanted to get some kind of peace deal in Vietnam for his own legacy because he knew that it would be forever tarnished. And midsummer, he got word from the Soviet Union that they were willing to apply pressure on North Vietnam, and they would guarantee that if he called a bombing halt, that the subsequent talks between North Vietnam and South Vietnam would be productive. And so Lyndon Johnson got very excited, and he called a bombing halt. And then all of a sudden, in the midst of the roll-up to what were supposed to be these talks in Paris, the South Vietnamese began to drag their feet. And it all looked like a cynical political trick on Johnson's part to get Hubert Humphrey elected, and the talks fell apart, and Nixon snuck into the presidency. Well, as it turns out, Nixon had sent an envoy, a woman named Anna Sanault, to the South Vietnamese and told them, hold out a little bit longer. Once Nixon is elected, you'll get a better deal. We're going to win. Now, Johnson knew this because he had the FBI tailing her and eavesdropping on the South Vietnamese embassy in Washington, D.C., but he never could prove that Nixon had given the orders, that she hadn't done this on her own. And Nixon denied it in a very famous tape from the Johnson presidency's secret taping system. The two of them are on the phone together, and Nixon denies it. Years later, he denied it again in his famous interviews with David Frost. And then there I am in Yorba Linda going through a file on the Vietnam War and the 68 campaign. And there are these notes from his chief of staff, Bob Haldeman, in which Nixon clearly says, send Anna Chennault to work on the South Vietnamese. Anything we can do to monkey wrench the peace talks. So there it was. I think it's more reprehensible than anything that he actually did in Watergate because of the great number of lives that were at stake. You can't make the easy leap and say, oh, the war would have been over in the fall of 68, but as a biographer, you have to look at this guy and say, what kind of man running for the presidency puts a peace deal at stake for his own advancement. And that's the kind of behavior I think that for somebody writing a biography of Nixon is very, very instructive.
Do you think that Watergate and some of these other things, the Houston plan, all this sort of paranoia put together, that maybe it was driven by the fear that this Chennault thing would come out? Or is that too much?
No, there are references, very intriguing references on the White House tapes where Nixon, he always had a shorthand for everything. And then his shorthand for this whole episode was Johnson and the bombing halt. And so he would say things to Haldeman or to Kissinger like, well, remember Johnson and the bombing halt. And what he really meant was this whole episode of skullduggery right there on the brink of the election. He knew that Lyndon Johnson would have been embarrassed to have revealed that he was bugging an American ally and the opposition campaign. So he knew he had a little bit of leverage over Johnson as well. But he also gave leverage to President Tu in Saigon. And because the South Vietnamese knew this, and they now had Nixon where they wanted him, and they could drag their feet. That war went on for another 5 years, 20,000 more American lives, and hundreds of thousands of Asian lives, when possibly it could have been ended in 1968.
Yeah, wow. You uncovered this in these special files, right? These boxes. Did you find these, uncover these, or did you Freedom of Information them? How did you get them?
Well, this was something that Nixon, if you remember way back when Nixon was leaving the White House, the tradition was that all presidents take their own papers and tapes with them. And then after many years of pawing through and getting the good stuff out, they would deed them over to the Library of Congress or to their private presidential library. But this was the one case where Congress actually passed a law and seized Nixon's papers, changed the way that these things were done. And Nixon went into court and spent $2 million in legal fees to keep the most sensitive political documents and personal documents away from the public.
Interesting.
And these were among the stuff that he was successful for so many years through his death. And I think it only became, I don't know this for sure, but I'm sure that the private Nixon Foundation just finally said, we have to store these in a climate proper place and make sure that mice don't get to them and anything. Why don't we just give them to the National Archives? And so they went to the National Archives, and that's where I found them.
Just briefly now, are there parallels you think that you see with Trump and the contacts with Russia before that have been alleged, the anti-press feelings, the anger, the blue-collar voters he's found versus the Southern strategy? Do you see similarities?
Oh, absolutely. There are major differences. Nixon was a serious intellectual. He read and wrote books. But as far as the behavior is concerned, you've had, break-ins at the DNC, wiretapping allegations. The press is the enemy. The press is the enemy. A press secretary who's the scorn of the press corps. And this is all in the first 75 days. So it's like Nixon speed dating,
Did you come away with a fundamental insight or something you didn't know about Nixon?
I did. One of the things that puzzled me immediately was that everybody who knew him and was still around and talked about him, they were very protective of him, almost as you would be with a wounded cousin or younger brother that you felt that you had to explain to people that Dick was a good guy, but he had these personality flaws and that manifested itself in horrible ways. But in heart, he had a horrible upbringing, and it was insecurities from that childhood that left him wounded the way he was. And I found a lot of that to be true.
Did you? Is it kind of tragic that you have this image of him as a kid, of being a dreamer, watching the trains go by, his house in Yorba Linda, into such a hard and ruthless and cynical guy?
Yeah, that's the great. The original title of the book was An American Tragedy because I thought that this was just a classic Horatio Alger story of this young kid escaping poverty, escaping a brutal household, almost like, Oliver Twist or David Copperfield, and clawing his way up the walls of life, as one of his aides was later to put it, reaching the pinnacle of the presidency, going to China, coming home, assuring decades of world peace, and then being succumbing to this fatal flaw, this insecurity, this feeling of burning resentment, and then losing it all. And so it's like something you'd see on a Greek stage or in a Shakespearean theater.
Got about a minute to go in this section. I often view him as the last architect, meaning someone that sort of ran a presidency and put in new architecture, China, détente, a lot of domestic stuff. Woodrow Wilson kind of was like that, and since then we have more tacticians. Do you see it that way at all?
Yeah, that's a great analogy. I hadn't thought of that, but he really was somebody who, in 1965, he wrote this piece in Foreign Affairs magazine about Asia after Vietnam, in which he predicted a world in which creativity and computerization would liberate large numbers of people from the totalitarian regimes that were predominant in the 20th century. It really was a visionary, and he really was visionary moments.
You kind of touched on this, but I want to start if we go back at the beginning. The psychological impact of the two deaths of his brothers and a dad who, as you say, couldn't grow lemons in a citrus belt. What's the impact on that?
He had two brothers who died when Nixon was a youth. The first one to die was his baby brother, Arthur, who was, the golden curled, happy young child, baby-faced Arthur that everybody adored in the family. And he caught meningitis and died within a week. And that was a great shock to everybody in the family. But within a matter of months, the elder brother, the best and brightest of the brothers, the star in his father's eyes, contracted tuberculosis. And that trashed the family's finances and split the parents up because the mother went to Arizona to take care of her eldest son, left Dick at home with his very brutish father, and ruined his chances to go to an Ivy League college. He was a very smart guy, obviously, could have gone to Harvard or Yale, and the family didn't even have the money to put him on a train or pay for his boarding in New Haven or Cambridge. So he came away with many resentments then of people like John Kennedy, who had everything handed to him, good looks, wealth, wit, and while Dick had to get up at 3 a.m., drive into Los Angeles to the farmer's market, pick out the vegetables and fruits for the little grocery store, drive them back, set them out, go to class, come home, work some more. And all the kids in Yorba Linda in Whittier would always talk about driving past this little crossroads at midnight or 1 a.m. in the morning on the way home from their dates and seeing Dick Nixon at the kitchen table slaving away at his books. So this is a guy who just worked really hard for everything that he got, and it marked him forever. He had this burning resentment for those who had it handed to them, and he was a very resolute enemy of anybody who tried to take what he had built away from him.
Is it a little pathetic or pathos? You see these where he writes these letters to Pat and calls himself a little dog. He drives her to dates with other men.
Yes, he had a very poor image of himself. There's a letter from his dean at Duke Law School who said that he was a very smart student, but he had a intellectual inferiority complex. And then when he goes away to war, he writes back to his newborn niece this really nice letter, but he says, "Yeah, this is from your Uncle Dick. I'm the sourpuss brother, the one that people don't like as easily as your dad, who's a happy-go-lucky Don." I mean, it was awful. When he came home from the Soviet Union with the strategic arms talk, the first big treaty cutting or capping nuclear weapons, came back from China. He's on the tapes with Henry Kissinger, saying, this is the American people are chumps. This means nothing. He just could not recognize his own accomplishments. Very sad. And of course, this sort of fed the paranoia that led to the downfall.
We get into politics now. He made his name on McCarthyism, the House Un-American Committee, which you in the book said people called it the Committee of Clowns. Was this made him? But was it Chambers' hiss? Was that all legitimate? Was it just opportunism? Where do you come out?
He certainly was opportunistic and ambitious, but he arrived in Washington at a time when the country was shocked by the fact that the atomic secrets had been sold to the Russians by spies that had riddled the Manhattan Project. There was an extrapolation made that if this happened in this secret project, it must have happened everywhere. And so that set us off on this Red Scare, hunting for communists under every bed that resulted in McCarthyism. But when Nixon arrived, it was a legitimate fear. The Soviet Union had been very successful planting spies throughout the United States government, and you have to remember that we were their allies for 4 years. So our guard was down because we were shipping tanks and planes to the Soviet Union. So if we were giving them the actual stuff, we didn't have to worry about them stealing the plans, right? So then the war ended, and as Eisenhower said, after 1948, everything changed. because the Soviet Union showed their appetite for consuming large parts of Eastern Europe. And Nixon heard that there was this guy, Alger Hiss, who had been a high-ranking State Department official, and orchestrated a campaign to show that that he was at least a communist, if not a spy, and it ended in a smashing political victory for Nixon, alienated the liberal press and New Deal liberals because they thought he was just using this case to tear down Franklin Roosevelt's legacy. So it had a mixed effect. It gave him this huge boost. It triggered the start of McCarthyism, and yet it also laid the seeds of the almost eternal war that he had with the American press, which is, for better or worse, the vehicle by which our leaders communicate with us.
Yeah, to me, it begat the expression Nixon in China, that somebody that could go make peace or cut a budget had to be sort of the opposite of your credibility came because you were such an anti-communist at one point.
Yeah.
The checkers thing.
There's a great place in one of the Star Trek movies where Mr. Spock is addressing the Federation, and he says, "There is an old Vulcan proverb: only Nixon could go to China." So,
exactly. And on checkers now, it's sort of the first time that Nixon somehow is able through a crisis to overcome, and he seems like he needs crises to function, but he got through this thing, right? And even though Ike didn't treat him very well,
he did. He was chosen as Eisenhower's vice presidential candidate in 1952, and he had made a lot of enemies in California. And as soon as the press went out to do their profiles about the new young senator from California that Eisenhower had chosen, it came to light that there was this campaign slush fund, that was being kept for things like airfare and stamps and Christmas cards. I mean, it wasn't anything truly nefarious, but it made a big splash because it was both a test of Nixon, this unknown vice presidential candidate, but also a test of Eisenhower. How was he going to handle this? And in the end, Nixon decided that he would go on national television and explain all his finances. And he did in a very maudlin way, talking about the fact that his wife didn't have a fur coat, but Pat has a good cloth Republican coat. And I'm not going to give back our little dog Checkers, which was a gift from a campaign supporter, as if anybody would ever demand that he give up his daughter's dog. But it was, you can watch it on YouTube. It is probably the single most effective use of television in that period, and maybe forever, since as television now becomes eclipsed by the internet. It may stand forever as just this amazing moment where he breathed new life right into his own mouth on television.
As we come to the end of this segment, the 60 campaign, did the great debates cost him the election? Did the 50-state commitment in trying to run the campaign, or was the election stolen?
I think yes to all those questions. I think that there was definitely shenanigans going on. Definitely votes were stolen in Illinois and Texas. Whether or not that would have been enough, or whether or not they would have been countermanded by votes that Republicans stole elsewhere, we'll never know. Nixon almost lost his own state of California, so a recount there could have switched the whole election the other way, even if Illinois and Texas had come in on Nixon's behalf. The first debate, he was awful. And especially, again, here's something else that your listeners can watch on YouTube. You can see his closing statement and JFK's closing statement. And JFK is right on target, repeating his themes in a concise, appealing manner. And Nixon is treating this like it's the Whittier College debate team, and he has to bring up a couple of statistics that need to be rebutted in his final statement. And he's awful in that regard. And there was an incident right towards the end of the campaign regarding Martin Luther King that the Kennedy campaign handled much better than the Nixon campaign, and resulted in a big black turnout in the inner city. So there were lots of reasons why Kennedy won, but I don't think that you can actually put your finger on one and say this was the one that determined it all.
You're listening to Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. We'll be back next. Nixon, the early years. And you're listening to Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell, The Road to Watergate.
I leave you gentlemen now, and you will now write it, you will interpret it, that's your right. But as I leave you, I want you to know, just think how much you're going to be missing. You don't have Nixon to kick around anymore.
And we're back with John Farrell, author of Richard Nixon, The Life. That, of course, was the California governor race, his apparent, or at the time, exit from politics. First off, why did he run for that job? He was never committed to it, right? And what do you take out of what he said?
Well, he never should have run for that because he never wanted to be governor of California. Right. His interests were always international affairs, and the idea of sitting in Sacramento planning highways and schools was just not where Richard Nixon was at. But the party prevailed upon him because they needed him, and he thought that might be a good perch by which to either challenge Kennedy in 64 or in 68. And for a variety of reasons, probably the most basic being that it was clear to the voters that he didn't want to be governor of California. He lost, and he called this what has come to be known as the last press conference because in addition to saying you're not going to have Nixon to kick around anymore, he also said, gentlemen, this is my last press conference. And, of course, it wasn't 2 more years before he was out on the campaign trail again campaigning for Republican candidates. And within 6 years, he was in the President of the United States. So, again, one more amazing twist in the career of Richard Nixon.
Going into that wilderness period before he comes back out and wins in 68, do you buy that there was a new Nixon, or was that just a marketing cereal box kind of thing?
Well, it was both. I think he was definitely getting older and more mature. But the word that was used over and over again by even liberal authors like Hunter Thompson and Norman Mailer was that there was a mellow Nixon, and I'm not so sure that there really was a mellow Nixon, or if there was, the old Dick Nixon emerged within 6 or 9 months once he was in the crucible of the presidency.
As we look at the foreign policy side, the Vietnamization, does that come to be rather cynically just get a decent interval so we can get out of here, even though a lot of lives are going to be lost while we hang on to this?
He announced in the campaign that he was a peace candidate, and then he hinted that he had this great plan to end the war. And what the plan was to try to get the Soviet Union to pressure the North Vietnamese to reach some sort of agreement. And the way he was going to do that is that he was going to have a linkage with what the Soviets wanted in other parts of the world. And he never offered them, or they never really wanted anything that was worth having their foremost rival bogged down in this horrible war in Southeast Asia. And so that didn't work. And so they had to come up, they meaning Nixon and his advisors, most notably Henry Kissinger, had to come up with alternate plans. And the best they had was a slow withdrawal by turning over the country to the Vietnamese. And it would be a race because there was they didn't have any confidence that the South Vietnamese would be able to handle their own defense against the much more motivated and hardy and equipped and experienced North before he felt he had to get out, which was by the 72 elections. So it was cynical in that regard. In order to get out, he had to go to both the Chinese and the Russians and say, look, we're not asking for a final deal. We're asking you to pressure North Vietnam to give us what became known as a decent interval where we can go home with our flags flying, win re-election, and pretend that anything happens after we left is just the South Vietnamese ineptitude, which pretty much is what we got. We didn't get much of an interval, and it certainly wasn't very decent.
It's very much unknown. I don't know if the word is liberal or not, but forming the EPA, the Clean Air Act, a health care proposal, a welfare proposal, OSHA. I didn't know he did Title IX, which is a big sports equality, desegregation. What do you think about the domestic side? And did he try to portray he didn't care?
Well, what he wanted out of the domestic side was to do what the country, what the people wanted, and this was still an era of activist government where people expected government to fix stuff. They had You have to remember that his generation had used big government to defeat Hitler and Stalin, and they built the interstate highway system and a whole bunch of other wonderful things that so the government did not have the connotation that it had later on after Jimmy Carter and then when Reagan came in and said government is the problem. Some of those things, he had a Democratic Congress, so a lot of those things were thrust upon him. Desegregation was thrust upon him by the United States Supreme Court. And some things he had ulterior motives. He was a big and early proponent of affirmative action, but in part that was because it was a great way to split the Democratic Party's labor and minority bases. The environmental stuff was definitely self-initiated by Nixon. He was in office for more than a few weeks when they had the big Santa Barbara oil spill, which was one of the first big environmental catastrophes. It really fueled the environmental movement that followed. And Nixon was quite content, very happy to sign all those legislation that the Democratic Congress sent him. On some things were cynical. The Title IX thing in particular, I always got a chuckle out of because the tapes and the correspondence show that he was getting all these letters from Father Herzberg, who was the president of Notre Dame, or Woody Hayes, the coach at Ohio State, saying, you can't do this. This is going to ruin our football programs. And yet Nixon went ahead and signed Title IX, and it's one of those accomplishments hanging there on the wall at the Nixon Library in Yorba Linda.
The road to Watergate, one of the things I find intriguing is he brings in these statesmen who wouldn't even have supported him. I'm talking Kissinger, Daniel Patrick Moynihan. They weren't necessarily even conservative, particularly Moynihan. On the other side, you've got H.R. Haldeman and John Ehrlichman, the sort of Prussian guards, Charles Colson. Is this the dichotomy of Nixon, these statesmen side by side by the dark side?
He had an interesting way of handling personnel. He wanted his administrative side of his presidency structured very rigidly. And so that's why he had Haldeman act in a certain way. And Moynihan, who was much more free form, was sort of pushed aside, and Ehrlichman came in to take over domestic affairs. But never to the point that he denied brilliance. I mean, he saw brilliance in somebody like Moynihan or Kissinger. He was very good at bringing it in. Elliot Richardson, George Shultz. There's one footnote in the book that it's about 2 inches long, and it's just the names of great American office holders who got their feet wet during the Nixon administration.
It is an amazing list, yeah. Yeah,
it is. Including one president, George Herbert Warren Bush. So, like many things about Nixon, it's tempting to say, one thing, the Berlin Wall, but then you have to sort of say, and yet. When I talk to an audience, I'm always saying that those are the two key words that you have to keep in mind with Richard Nixon, is that as soon as you say one thing, there's always going to be a but or an and yet, and something else on the other side. He's a very, very deft politician until it came to that great crisis where it was us versus them, and he completely fell apart.
I got the sense that you put a fair amount of blame on Haldeman for the culture that he sort of let Nixon be Nixon too much, that he used Colson to sort of go sit with Nixon so he wouldn't have to spend hours, and Colson just did nothing but suck the devil out of him.
Haldeman occasionally, or maybe even often, would just ignore Nixon's crazier orders. And Nixon had actually put this in a memo. He'd actually sent it to his top staff saying, look, there's going to be times when I say things that you're allowed to not obey me, as long as you come back within 24 or 48 hours and say, that thing you told us the other day, boss, we didn't think that was a great idea, and here's why we didn't do it. So this was sort of built into the Nixon White House, but it was a heck of a way to run a railroad. When you get somebody like Charles Colson was brought in, who wasn't a long-time Nixon aide, who didn't have good judgment, and who saw that this skullduggery was one way that he could, as one of the Watergate prosecutors put it, he was the cat who could bring the dead mouse and put it at the master's door. He's the one who brought in Howard Hunt and led them down the road to the creation of the plumbers and eventually to Watergate. Interestingly enough, J. Edgar Hoover, who was the head of the FBI and had done all these dirty tricks for previous presidents, he saw that the times were changing and that he was very much afraid the FBI would be caught in some kind of scandal just like Watergate, and that's why he wouldn't let his agents indulge in the kind of behavior that they had done, bugging and burglaring for other presidents. And so Nixon's great initiative and his great downfall was that he brought the dirty tricks boys inside the White House, set him up as his own private little detective agency. And so when they were caught, the trail led directly to the Oval Office.
I think that there's no doubt about the seriousness of the problem we've got. We have a cancer close to the presidency that's growing.
By the way, that was a perfect segue right into the Oval Office. We'll just finish off this segment. Does Nixon, hearing that, is he stunned? Is he acting? Did he know everything?
He knew everything. He was constantly on Haldeman and Ehrlichman. The one thing that happened in the course of me writing this book was that the final tranches of tapes came out. We now had, I think, 3,000 of the 3,700 hours of tapes. They were at my disposal. Some excellent scholars have created books and websites where you go online, you can listen to them yourself. The greatest hits are on YouTube. But it clearly shows that Nixon was constantly talking about his men committing perjury, finding hush money to pay off the burglars throughout that whole summer and fall of 1972.
The final days, Jack, was he mentally ill? Was he breakdown, drinking? Describe the end.
I think if you say the final days, starting maybe the fall of 1973, he was in a series of crises. If you remember, Vice President Spiro Agnew had to resign.
Yeah.
They had the summer of Watergate. There was war in the Middle East. There was further problems with the Soviet Union. And so Nixon was under a tremendous amount of pressure, and he was drinking heavily. It's somewhat exaggerated, I think, to say that he was smashed all the time or that he couldn't perform the duties of his office. But even some of his most fervent defenders within the diplomatic community and on his staff said, yeah, this was a problem that they had to work around in 73 and 74. And, of course, by the time of the summer of 74 came along, he was under just tremendous stress and almost died from attack of phlebitis and depression when he went into exile in San Clemente after resigning the presidency.
All right, and as we leave the presidency...
Always remember, others may hate you, but those who hate you don't win unless you hate them. And then you destroy yourself.
That quote has always blown me away because it's like the only time that Nixon has ever been sort of introspective and insightful, right?
Right, and it's at the very end, and all of a sudden there's this amazing moment of self-recognition.
Yes.
And it's so sad. And one more time, the marvels of the Internet is that anybody who's listening, you can watch him say that. And I challenge you to watch him on YouTube and not feel a sense that this was one of the truly great tragic moments in American history.
Just an amazing moment, and he wore glasses which he never wore to read, and the whole thing. It was now in exile. Did he get this drive for resurrection, wallow in self-pity? How did he turn it around? Or what was his drive?
I think he turned it around by writing books. He made money doing that. He had some very rich friends who still protected him after he left the presidency. I think the David Frost interviews were a masterful stroke on both Frost and Nixon's part. They were really gripping drama. But his efforts to worm his way back into diplomatic circles were capped, I think, by the fact that he was so politically toxic. At his funeral, Bob Dole gave the eulogy and broke down crying.
I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah. Among other things, Nixon was the one politician who always remembered to extend his left hand to shake hands with Bob Dole because Bob Dole had been wounded and lost the use of his right hand. But Bob Dole had this wonderful joke. Same guy, Bob Dole, who wept at the funeral, seeing Jerry Ford, Jimmy Carter, and Nixon going off to Anwar Sadat's funeral, said, there they are, hear no evil, see no evil, and evil.
Jack, that just reminded me, talking about funerals, Nixon controlled his emotions all his life, but I remember at Pat Nixon's funeral, who everybody thought he sort of almost abused, that he almost looked like he was collapsing.
Yes, the agony on his face at a funeral, it's hard. hard to take. There's a picture in the book taken that day, and it's hard for me to look at.
Did he got Ford, Carter, Reagan, George H.W. Bush, Clinton succeeding? Did he respect them? Did he respect any of them? Did he think they were in his league?
No, definitely not. I think that he respected certain gifts that each of them may have had. Interesting that you say that, because I always feel that 100 years from now, people are going to look back at the Cold War presidents, and they're going to judge them as a group, and I think they're going to give them pretty high marks for having navigated this very dangerous period where there were 40,000 nuclear weapons on the earth pointed at these 2 or 3, 4 countries, and we managed to skate our way through it. And so I think they will get good marks, and I think he will be always sitting there with Truman and Eisenhower and JFK and Johnson and Jimmy Carter and Jerry Ford and finally Reagan. They'll all be seen as stewards in a very difficult time, and I think that their violations of civil liberties and the brush wars that they got us into, the proxy wars, will be taken into account. One of the things that I've noticed just in doing the book and going around and talking to young audiences is how much Vietnam has receded and is now being put up on the shelf there next to the Korean War as something that happened a long time ago, that there was a modest loss of life, but not the big searing event that it was to those of us who lived through it. Right.
As we finish up on the legacy side, they talk about blessed are the peacemakers. Do you think will he get a peacemaker credit? Do you see him ranking anywhere high?
Well, it's amazing that he's in the mid-20s, which you would think he'd be down there with James Buchanan at the bottom. But I think because of the domestic legislation that he signed, I think because especially the vision of taking advantage of the split between the Russians and the Chinese, and opening China was a masterful stroke. Others might have done it, but he's the one who did it. So I think he'll always be the president who resigned. I think he'll always be a fascination to young people as the guy who's the cartoon on The Simpsons, the caricature of the bad guy. And yet, because of China and because of some of the other domestic things that he did on EPA and others.
In just a couple of seconds, is he ultimately an elusive character?
No, I found him actually, much simpler and less complex than I expected.
Interesting. Oh, this has been a fast hour. Thanks to John Farrell. The book is Richard Nixon, The Life, a fascinating book. Thanks, everybody, for listening. We'll see you again next Monday night on Forensic Talk.